Tonight on this SBS exclusive, we bring you a rare one-on-one interview with Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. After 2 years of negotiations, SBS reporter Luke Waters has secured an exclusive Australian first, a 25-minute sit-down with the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. The interview came with restrictions. We provided topic areas for questions and were asked to play the interview in full. These are the same conditions for all of President Assad's interviews, not just SBS. The interview took place in the presidential palace in Damascus and was recorded just 2 days ago.
Just crossed the Lebanese border, bound for the Syrian capital of Damascus. And I was here just a few months ago covering the humanitarian crisis and even spent some time embedded on the front line of the battlefield. But this trip will be very different. I've finally been granted a sit-down interview with the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. And I'm intrigued to hear what this man has to say after presiding over this country for more than 5 years of bloodshed and destruction. Mr. President, thank you for speaking with SBS Australia.
You're most welcome.
It's now more than 5 years since the Syrian crisis began. It's estimated somewhere around 250,000 people have been killed, many of them civilians. There's an undeniable humanitarian disaster. How far into the crisis do you think you are, and is there an end in sight?
Of course there's insight, and the solution is very clear. It's simple yet impossible. It's simple because the solution is very clear, how to make it discussion between the Syrian dialogue, between the Syrian about the political process, but at the same time fighting the terrorism and the terrorists in Syria. Without fighting terrorists, you cannot have any real solution. It's impossible because the countries that supported those terrorists, whether Western or regional like Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, don't want to stop sending all kind of support to those terrorists. So if we start with stopping this logistical support, and as Syrians go to dialogue, talk about constitution, about the future of Syria, about the future of the political system, the solution is very near, not far from the reach.
Much of the reporting at the West at the moment suggests that the demise of the Islamic State is imminent. Do you believe that's true, and how far away from seizing Raqqa, this very important city of Raqqa, do you believe you are?
It's not a race. Raqqa is as important as Aleppo, as Damascus, as any other city. The danger of those terrorist groups is not about what land do they occupy, because it's not a traditional war. It's about how much of their ideology can they instill in the mind of the people in the area that they sit or live in. Indoctrination, this is the most dangerous thing. Reaching Raqqa is not that difficult militarily, let's say. It's a matter of time. We are going in that direction. But the question when you talk about war is about what the other side, let's say the enemy, could do. And that's directly related to the effort of Turkey, especially Erdogan, in supporting those groups, because that's what's happening since the beginning. If you talk about Syria as isolated military field, you can reach that area within a few months or few weeks, let's say. But without taking into consideration the Turkish effort in supporting the terrorists, any answer would be far cry from the reality, unfactual answer.
Mr. President, how concerned are you about recent fatal clashes between your long-time ally Hezbollah and your own forces?
Fighting between us and Hezbollah? There are no fighting. They support the Syrian army. They don't fight against the Syrian army. They fight with the Syrian army. The Syrian army and Hezbollah, with the support of the Russian Air Forces, we are fighting all kinds of terrorist groups, whether ISIS or Al-Nusra, or other affiliated group with Al-Qaeda that's affiliated automatically to Al-Nusra and ISIS.
So there have been some recent reports of clashes between. Are those reports incorrect?
No, they are talking not about clashes, about, let's say, differences in different opinions. That's not true. And if you look at the meeting that happened recently between the Minister of Defense in Iran, in Tehran, Syrian, Russian, and Iranian. And this means there's a good coordination regarding fighting terrorism.
To be clear, do you categorise all opposition groups as terrorists?
No, definitely not. No. When you talk about opposition group that adopt the political means, they're not terrorists. Whenever you hold machine guns or any other armaments, and you terrorize people, and you attack civilians, and you attack public and private properties, you are terrorists. But if you talk about opposition, when you talk about opposition, it must be Syrian opposition. It cannot be a surrogate opposition that work as a proxy to other countries like Saudi Arabia or any other country. It must be Syrian opposition that's related to its Syrian grassroots. Like in your country, it's the same, I think.
You said recently that the ceasefire offered Syrian people at least a glimmer of hope. How, 5 months on, do you think that hope is going?
Yeah, it is. It's still working, this ceasefire. But we don't have to forget that terrorist groups violate this agreement on daily basis. But at the same time, we have the right, according to that agreement, to retaliate whenever the terrorists attack our government forces. So actually, you can say it's still working in most of the areas, but in some area, it's not.
There are various accounts of how the Syrian crisis began. Some say it was children graffitiing anti-government slogans and they were dealt with brutally by the government. I understand you don't accept that narrative. How, in your view, did the crisis begin?
It's a mixture of many things. Some people demonstrated because they needed reform. We cannot deny this. We cannot say, no, everybody was a terrorist or everyone was mercenary. But the majority of those demonstrators, I'm not talking about the genuine demonstrators, were paid by Qatar in order to demonstrate. Then later they paid by Qatar in order to revolt with armaments. And that's how it started, actually. The story of a children being attacked, this is an elusive story. It didn't happen. Of course, you always have, let's say, mistakes happening in the practice on the ground, like what happened in the United States recently during the last year. But this is not a reason for people to hold machine guns and kill policemen and soldiers and so on.
You do say that some of these people legitimately needed reform. Was that as a result of any heavy-handedness from your government at all?
No, we had the reform in Syria started mainly after 2000, in the year 2000. Some people think it was slow, some people think it was too fast. This is subjective, not objective. But we were moving in that regard. But the proof that it wasn't about the reform, because we made all the requested reform after the crisis started 5 years ago, and nothing has changed. So it wasn't about reform. We changed the constitution, we changed the law that the opposition asked for, we changed many things, but nothing happened. So it wasn't about the reform. It was about money coming from Qatar, and most of the people that genuinely asked for reform at the beginning of the crisis, they don't demonstrate now. They don't go against the government. They cooperate with the government. They don't believe, let's say, in the political line of this government. And this is their right, and that's natural. But they don't work against the government or against the state institutions. So they distinguish themselves from the people who supported the terrorists.
How do you respond to the fact that some of your own ministers defected and cited brutality as a reason?
Actually, they defected because they've been asked to do so by some of them Saudi Arabia, some of them by France. It depends on the country they belong to. And now they are belonging to that so-called opposition that belonged to those countries, not to the Syrian. They have no values in Syria. So we wouldn't worry about that. It didn't change anything. I mean, it didn't affect the fact or the reality in Syria.
One of your main backers, Russia, has called for a return to the peace talks. Do you think that's a good idea?
You mean in Geneva?
Yes.
Yeah, of course, we support every talk with every Syrian party. But in reality, those talks hasn't been started yet. And there's no Syrian talk till this moment, because we only made negotiations with the facilitator, which is Mr. de Mistura. Actually, it hasn't started. So we support the principle, but in practice, you need to have certain methodology that didn't exist so far. So we need to start, but we need to have the basic principles for those negotiations to be fruitful.
One thing that intrigues a lot of people about the Syrian crisis is why your close allies, Iran and Russia, stay so loyal.
Because it wasn't about the president. It's not about the person. This is the misinterpretation, or let's say the misconception in the West, and maybe part of the propaganda, that Russia and Iran supported Assad or supported the president. It's not like this. It's about the whole situation. The chaos in Syria is going to provoke a domino effect in our region. That's going to affect the neighboring countries, it's going to affect Iran, it's going to affect Russia, it's going to affect Europe, actually. So when they defend Syria, they defend the stability, and they defend their stability, they defend their interests. And at the same time, it's about the principle. They defend the Syrian people in their right to protect themselves. Because if they defend the president and the Syrian people are not with him, don't support him, I cannot withstand 5 years just because Russia and Iran support me. So it's not about the president, it's about the whole situation, the bigger picture, let's say.
Do you have any dialogue, either direct or indirectly, with the United States?
At all, nothing at all. Indirect, yes, indirect through different channels, but if you ask them, they will deny it, and we're going to deny it. But in reality, it exists, the back channels.
What are some of those channels?
I mean, let's say a businessman traveling around the world and meeting with the officials in the United States, I mean, in Europe, they meet in Europe, and they try to convey certain messages, but there's nothing serious, because we don't think the administration, the American administration, is serious about solving the problem in Syria.
Well, quite recently, there were reports more than 50 diplomats have called for what they describe as real and effective military strikes against Syria. Does this in any way concern you, and do you think it signals a more aggressive policy from the United States towards Syria moving forward?
No, warmongers in every American administration always exist. It's not something new. But we wouldn't give a fig, let's say, about this communique, because it's not about this communique, it's about the policy, it's about the actions. The difference between this administration and the previous one, Bush's one, that Bush sent his troops, this one is sending mercenary, and turn blind eye to what Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Qatar did since the beginning of the crisis. So it's the same policy. It's a militaristic policy, but in different ways. So this communique is not different from the reality on the ground. This is asking for war, and the reality is a war.
You refer to the previous government, the Bush government. There are some who say one of the reasons you've survived as long as a government has been America's reluctance to get on the ground in another war in the Middle East. Do you not accept that based on what you're saying?
Yeah, the American administration since the 50s are very famous of creating problems, but they never solve any problem. And that's what happened in Iraq. Bush invaded Iraq. In a few weeks, he could occupy Iraq. But then what's next? It's not about occupying. This is a great power. We're not a great power. So it's not about America occupying Syria. What's next? What do they want to achieve? They haven't achieved anything. They have failed in Libya, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Syria, everywhere. They only created chaos. So if the United States want to create more chaos, it can. It can create chaos. But can they solve the problem? No.
Do you have a preference who wins the upcoming US election?
Actually, no, we never bet on any American president, because usually what they say in the campaign is different from their practice after they become president, and Obama is an example. So we don't have to wait. We have to wait and see what policy they're going to adopt, whoever wins the elections.
So you can see a circumstance where Syria would work collaboratively with the United States and the West?
We don't have problem with the United States. They're not our enemy. They don't occupy our land. We have differences, and those differences goes back to the 70s and maybe before that. But we in many different times, let's say, and events and circumstances, we had cooperation with the United States. So we're not against this cooperation, but this cooperation means talking about and discussing and working for the mutual interest, not for the interest at the expenses of our interests. That's it. So we don't have a problem.
Mr. President, you've spent a lot of time yourself, as you've just said, in the United Kingdom. Can you see there being any repercussions for Britain's decision to exit the European Union for Syria and for the Syrian crisis?
Maybe I don't think I can elaborate about that as it's a British issue. I'm not British, neither European, but at the same time I can say that this surprising maybe result has many different components, whether they're internal as economic and external as the worry from the terrorism, security issues, refugees, and so on. But this is indication for us as those officials who used to give me the advice about how to deal with the crisis in Syria and say Assad must go and he's disconnected, proven that to be disconnected from the reality. Otherwise, they wouldn't have asked for this referendum. But I think this is a revolt of the people there against, I would call them sometimes second-tier politicians. They needed special, let's say, statecraft official to deal their country. If another administration came and understand that the issue of refugees and security is related to the problem in our region, this is where you're going to have different policies that will affect us positively. But I don't have now a lot of hopes about this. Let's say we have slim hope because we don't know who's going to come after Cameron in the UK.
Can I ask, Australia is part of the international coalition to defeat Islamic State. Obviously, that's one of your goals, so in that instance, there's a shared goal. Do you welcome international intervention when there is a shared goal like that?
Actually, we welcome any effort to fight terrorism in Syria, any effort. But this effort, first of all, should be genuine, not window dressing like what's happening now in the northern Syria, where 60 countries couldn't prevent ISIS from expanding. Actually, when the Russian air support started, only that time when ISIS started expanding. So it needs to be genuine. Second, it needs to be through the Syrian legitimate government, not just because they want to fight terrorism and they can go anywhere in the world. We are a legitimate government and we are a sovereign country. So only under these two circumstances, we welcome any foreign support to fight terrorism.
A number of Australians have died fighting for either the Kurdish militia or Islamic State. Do you have a message for these young people who feel so enraged by what's taking place in Syria that they travel over here to fight?
Again, the same, let's say, answer. If there's foreigners coming without the permission of the government, they are illegal. Whether they want to fight terrorists or want to fight any other one. It's the same. It's illegal, we can call it.
Mr. President, Australian politicians have used very strong language about your role in the crisis, as have other leaders internationally. Australia's Prime Minister has referred to you as a murderous tyrant, saying that you're responsible for killing thousands of innocent civilians. Australia's opposition leader has called you a butcher. Yet Australia's official position is still to work with you toward a peace agreement. How do you reconcile those two very different positions?
Actually, this is the double standard of the West in general. They attack us politically and they send us the officials to deal with us under the table, especially the security, including your government. They all do the same. They don't want to upset the United States. Actually, most of the Western officials, they only repeat what the United States want them to say. This is the reality. So I think these statements, just I can say they are disconnected from our reality, because I'm fighting terrorists. Our army fighting terrorists. Our government is against terrorists. The whole institution are against terrorists. If you call fighting terrorism a butchery, that's another issue.
Australia has agreed to take in an additional 12,000 Syrian refugees. Some have already arrived. Do you have a message for the Syrians, many of whom still say they love Syria and they want to return? Do you have a message to those people as they settle in Australia and other countries around the world?
Actually, you mentioned a very important point. Most of the refugees that left Syria, they wanted to come back to Syria. So any country that helped them enter their new country, let's say their new homeland, is welcome as a humanitarian action. But again, there's something more humanitarian and less costly, is to help them stay in their country, help them going back by helping the stability in Syria, not giving any umbrella or support to the terrorists. That's what they want. They want the Western government to take decisive decision against what Saudi Arabia and other Western countries like France and UK doing in order to support the terrorists in Syria against the government, just to topple the government. Otherwise, those Syrians wouldn't have left Syria. Most of them, they didn't leave because they are against the government or with the government. They left because it's very difficult to live in Syria these days.
Do you hope these people will return, and would you facilitate for them to return?
Definitely. I mean, losing people as refugees is like losing human resources. How can you build a country without human resources? Most of those people are educated, well-trained, they have their own business in Syria, in different domains. You lose all this, of course we need.
The Commission for International Justice and Accountability says there are thousands of government documents which say has proved your government sanctioned mass torture and killings. In the face of that evidence, how do you say that no crimes have taken place? And I point also to other independent organisations which are critical of deliberate targeting of hospitals. Do you concede that some mistakes have been made as you've targeted some of these rebel-held areas?
You are talking about two different things.
Yes.
One of them, the first one is the reports. The most important report that's been financed by Qatar, just to defame the Syrian government. And they have no proof who took the picture, who are the victims in those pictures, and so on. Like you can forge anything if you want now on the computer. So it's not credible at all. Second, talking about attacking hospitals or attacking civilians. The question, the very simple question is, why do we attack hospitals and civilians? I mean, the whole issue, the whole problem in Syria started when those terrorists wanted to win the hearts of the Syrians. So attacking hospitals or attacking civilians is playing into the hands of the terrorists. So if we put the values aside now for a while, let's talk about the interest. No government in this situation have any interest in killing civilians or attacking hospitals. Anyway, if you attack hospitals, you can use any building to be a hospital. No, these are anecdotal claims, mendacious statements, I can say. They're not credible at all. We're still sending vaccines to those areas under the control of the terrorists. So how can I send vaccines and attack the hospitals? This is contradiction.
Mr. President, as a father and as a man, has there been one anecdote, one story, one image from the crisis which has affected you personally more than others?
Definitely. Definitely. We are human, and I'm Syrian like the other Syrian. I will be more sympathetic with any Syrian tragedy affecting any person or family. And in this region, we are very emotional people, generally. But as an official, I'm not the only person, I'm official. As official, the first question you ask when you have that feeling is what are you going to do? What are you going to do to protect other Syrians from the same suffering? That's the most important thing. So that's what can, I mean, this feeling, this sad feeling, this painful feeling is incentive for me to do more. It's not only a feeling.
What's your vision for Syria? How do you see things in 2 to 3 years?
After the crisis, or so the first thing we would like to see is to have Syria stable as it used to be before, because it was one of the most stable country and secure country around the world, not only in our region. So this is the first thing. If you have this, you can have other ambitions. Without it, you cannot. I mean, if you have it, the other question, how to deal with the new generation that live the life of killing, that saw the extremism or learned the extremism or indoctrinated by Al-Qaeda affiliated groups and so on. This is another challenge. The third one, bringing back those human resources that left as refugees in order to rebuild Syria. Rebuilding the country as building and so on, our infrastructure is very easy. We are capable of doing this as Syrians. The challenge is about the new generation.
How do you think history will reflect on your presidency?
What I wish is to say that this is the one who saved his country from the terrorists and from the external intervention. That's what I wish about. Anything else would be left to the judgment of the Syrian people, but this is my only wish.
Mr. President, thank you very much for speaking with SBS Australia.
Thank you very much.
Good evening. Peace talks that hope to find a resolution to Syria's bloody 5-year civil war are expected to begin tomorrow. The Geneva discussions were postponed because of disagreements over who should be at the negotiating table. The United States is urging all opposition groups to participate without preconditions.
As the talks close in, though, the battles continue to rage on fronts across the war-torn country. SBS reporter Luke Waters has been embedded with the Syrian army and gained exclusive frontline access to a government unit fighting on the outskirts of the capital.
Throughout the 5 years of the Syrian civil war, a constant narrative from the rebels has been to seize the country's capital, Damascus. Here at Jobar, about 8 kilometres from the city centre, the fighting has been prolonged, unpredictable and brutal. A government soldier discharges rounds from a frontline bunker in Jobar, once a thriving residential and industrial precinct. 3 years of fighting has reduced it to this. Riddled with bullets, pounded by mortars, remnants of buildings litter the landscape, now a battlefield. Scattered among the crumbling concrete, soldiers sit poised, ready for movement on the other side. A firehole offers a glimpse of opposition territory, occupied predominantly by the rebel insurgents from Jaish al-Islam, or the Army of Islam. Colonel Ahmed Zaka leads the government force defending Jobar. The 50-year-old has spent just 2 days at his own home in the past 14 months.
وبإذن الله تعالى بالأيام القادمة سوف تكون آمنة كامل محيط مدينة دمشق وبالتالي دحر الإرهابيين أينما وجدوا على هذه الأرض في سوريا.
He's been wounded 4 times and refuses to wear any symbol of rank, saying he and his soldiers live and fight together. They're like family.
أيضا المقاتلين بشكل عام هون مثل ما انتبهتوا أثناء العمل معنويات جيدة، نفسيات ممتازة، العلاقات رفاقية جدا، والأهم من هيك إيمانهم بالقضية.
The colonel says his unit reflects the Syria he defends, comprising Christian, Shia and Sunni Muslim soldiers. This is literally the front line of the Syrian civil war, and we're told that the rebel groups could be between 20 and 50 metres away. But most disturbingly, the colonel has just informed me that they could also be anywhere underground. There's a nest of tunnels in this complex, and they don't know precisely their location at any given time. The tunnels are pivotal in this battlefield, and those who know them best have a tactical edge. At different times, both sides have held ascendancy in underground clashes, and they've been active lately. This soldier recounts a recent battle in which 3 opposition fighters were killed in an above-ground clash. Dozens died underground. For these men, life on the front line is tough, the possibility of death ever present, but a common goal unites them.
في واحد من المقاتلين بشكل عام ما راح حدا يهناله قاعدة في بيته أو في وسط أهله إلا تعود البسمة على كافة على وجه وتم كل طفل سوري.
And judging by the situation here on the ground, that could be some time yet. In Jobar, Syria, Luke Waters, SBS World News.
For the millions of Syrians fleeing war-ravaged regions, the capital Damascus offers a relative safe haven from heavy fighting.
But clashes continue on the city's outskirts and mortars regularly fall on Damascus streets. SBS reporter Luke Waters travelled to Syria under restrictions from the government and filed this report.
At times in Damascus, it's easy to forget war rages nearby. The city centre, for those who can afford it, nightlife thrives. And by day, most of the city functions, all things considered, surprisingly well. Military checkpoints dot the streets and electricity cuts out several times a day. Mobile phone reception is good and shopping precincts are busy, although most locals can afford little more than necessities. For long-time traders in the old city, war has all but ended enterprise. After 40 years building his business, antiquities dealer Papa Joseph Al-Maria was forced to sell his shop
and now trades from a small stall.
No, we have no business because we deal by foreign people, tourists, you see, and from 5 years, no business.
Here in the old city of Damascus, you're still only a handful of kilometres away from the front line. While there's the occasional thud of mortars, on the whole, the city feels quite safe. And given what's taken place over the past 5 years, remarkably peaceful and inclusive.
Sunni Muslims are the dominant sect in a country under the rule of an Alawite president. Alawites are an offshoot of Shiism, but here in Damascus, religious divisions are largely ignored. Worshippers attend mosques and churches side by side, and minorities such as Christians, Kurds and Druze mix seemingly without incident or issue. The prevailing question, though, for all Damascenes, to stay or to go. For journalist Ubaida Hamad, the answer's easy.
Homeland is not a motel. If you don't like it, you can change it. It's a homeland. It's something in your blood, in your genes.
But for the father of two, that decision comes at a price.
Every day when I leave my house and lock the door, I say goodbye to my wife and my children as the last time, as the farewell, goodbye.
He's determined his sons will be educated and eventually enjoy peace in Syria. But his 7-year-old son Hamzi's drawings already speak volumes.
This is a soldier. Yeah. This is a tank.
Dentist Bahan Al-Shirin is far less optimistic. He has a brother in Australia and has applied for a visa to join him. The reason, he says, is simple.
I leave Syria, go to Australia because my children not safe because bomb.
For millions of Syrians, Damascus offers relative safety. About 5 million people now inhabit the city compared to around 2 million before the crisis.
But rebel groups have made several attempts to take Damascus. One was here in the city's east, where Jabhat al-Nusra and the Army of Islam seized this precinct for about 3 weeks.
This woman was forced from her home when insurgents arrived. When government forces reclaimed the area, the family returned to their home with no electricity, no water and no alternative.
ما في حياة أبداً، معدومة الحياة، زبالة، قمامة، وسخ، قوارض، فئران، جرادين، حشرات، شيء مرعب يعني بالليل وأنت سهران.
Even for those in more affluent and seemingly safer precincts of the city, the threat is ever present and real. In Damascus, Syria, Luke Waters, SBS World News.
Of the 13 million Syrian people in need of humanitarian assistance, it's estimated 6 million are children. While much focus has been on those fleeing the war-ravaged country, there are 8 million internally displaced and unable to leave. SBS reporter Luke Waters visited Syria under government supervision and explored how the country is coping with the crisis.
For most displaced Syrian children, smiles are rare, but not here. This shelter, run by the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, delivers a range of programs for 5 to 17-year-olds. They include sport, music, learning and crucial induction counselling, where the level and type of trauma experienced is assessed by trained volunteers.
To help him to get through from the concupiscence or elderly violent scenes they had sensed or watched in their country.
After almost 5 years of fighting, statistics confronting young Syrians are grim.
One of the recent reports states that 1 out of 3 children are at risk of developing mental disorder because of trauma.
1 in 4 schools have been destroyed and 2 million children have fallen out of education. So learning is the major focus at most shelters.
They have this safe place to do these activities because the streets and the schools, the other places are not safe anymore.
Brothers Ahmed and Ali fled the fighting in Aleppo, arriving in Damascus a few months ago. They participate in most activities and volunteers say their situation has improved.
اليوم نفرح اليوم نفوز إنه هيك نقلبنا على الفريق كذا نفرح نضل
11-year-old Ahmed aspires to be an engineer, but also has a contingency.
أنا يمكن إذا ما عجبتنا المهندس بدي يصير ضابط بدي يدعس على هدول داعش.
Adult programs are also delivered. These women, some in their 60s, learn English.
Sir isn't a taxi driver, he is a bus driver. Okay, thank you.
Teacher Nabal Breckney says for some it's simply to fill time, but for others it's part of an exit strategy.
Maybe some of them they have an ambition or are going or thinking of maybe going out Syria, and maybe they need this language in order to handle their troubles, their life.
The government also runs residential shelters to cater for some of Syria's 8 million internally displaced. This building outside Damascus offers shelter, food and medicine. A huge vat of spaghetti bolognese will feed them all this day.
450 people are currently accessing services within the centre, but at times there have been as many as 3,000. With a cold, wet Syrian winter setting in, demand for services is predicted to increase significantly.
This woman, who wanted to remain anonymous, lost 5 of her 8 children in a mortar attack before escaping.
صرنا بعدين جوع يعني كثير نبيع أغراض بيتنا وناكل.
Muhammad is 37 and a mother of 11. She managed to bring 5 of her children to the government shelter. 6 remain in an IS-controlled area. The trauma of separation and fear of the unknown is clear on her children's faces.
هو نايم تحت الشباك اجت قذيفة شظية. يعني أولادي كثير تعبوا جوا.
Life is lived in the moment and access to services is unpredictable. Here, the absolute basics, safety, food and shelter, even temporary, is the displaced Syrians' pot of gold. In Damascus, Syria, Luke Waters, SBS World News.
Syria's war has now claimed an estimated 250,000 lives and left 8 million people displaced across the country. And children are often the silent victims.
An entire generation faces profound trauma, a lack of education and access to services. But in a modest shelter on the outskirts of Damascus, one man is using music to provide a diversion and some much-needed hope.
The concept couldn't be simpler. But judging by the interaction and enthusiasm, the results are remarkable. Most of these children have been exposed to unimaginable suffering. Music teacher Tariq Salia devised a program to encourage displaced children in a government shelter back to the classroom.
The magic of music changed everything to make it much better. After many lessons, they became changed. They laugh more, they enjoy more.
This basic song introduces the 4 to 11-year-olds to English language.
Listen to the letters. Listen to the letters.
For some, it's the first classroom they've visited in months or even years, so fun plays an important role.
You, Queen, are robots.
Give the children love, give the children hope in future, using music and songs. Talk about how to live together, not hate.
With 1 in 3 Syrian children said to develop a trauma-related disorder, experts say the benefits of what seems a simple program can't be underestimated.
It's very important to let the kids just live moments of childhood again. There is nothing better for a child than to move and to hear music and to dance.
There's little doubt the now 6-month-old program is having a positive impact, with many of these children now themselves aspiring music teachers.
أستاذ بفرح. ليش؟ أستاذ لأنه الأستاذ بحبنا، أستاذ بيدرسنا موسيقى وبيضحكنا.
Despite what's taking place in their homeland, the final song of every class is one of national pride. Tariq Salia says here Hope means the world.
The war, it will end one day, and I hope very soon. And in future, you'll make new Syria. You'll make your country much better, and they believe in this idea.
أستاذ بنحب إنه تضل أحلاها ما فيها شيء وترجع الأمور مثل ما كانت من قبل.
In Damascus, Syria, Luke Waters, SBS World News.
A one-time drug dealer turned IS jihadist has explained exclusively to SBS how he worked in the organisation's elaborate media and public relations department.
The man says he worked as a videographer and frequently filmed battlefield fatalities and beheadings. And we warn some viewers might find images in this story distressing.
At an undisclosed location in Lebanon, former IS operative Abdullah cuts a menacing figure. He says he carries weapons through necessity, explaining the terror group doesn't take kindly to those who leave. Abdullah says he joined initially for financial reasons, working in the group's highly developed media department. He learned quickly of its persuasive power, particularly over the vulnerable individuals it targets. A job as a videographer landing him squarely on the front line.
نحن كنا أكثر من نصور عم نصور بس نحن كنا نصور أكثر شيء بمعارك بس أنا طلبت منهم إنه بدي أصور هذا الشيء يعني عرفت؟
Abdullah provided SBS with a hard drive containing hours of videos. He says he filmed some of the material himself and retrieved some from the media centre. Among the images, recruitment speeches, battlefield activity, public executions, even beheadings, which he says haunt him to this day.
المعارك كثير مصور بالمعارك يعني المعارك اللي ما يكون ميت ما يطخ عليه يذبحوه بالسكين.
While their battlefield ideology might be archaic and brutal, IS productions are slick but importantly effective. The use of social and conventional media is effective in spreading the ideology, also attracting recruits.
It's largely about promoting this idea of building a utopian state, being part of an exciting project about standing up for the oppressed. And we know that's hollow and it's propaganda, but for young people who are not better informed, it's very convincing.
Deakin University terror expert Greg Barton says the IS media arm is often underestimated and dismantling it is pivotal.
The messaging and the communication networks, particularly via social media, will be more critical than ever. So if we don't address that, even military victories won't be enough to make this thing go away.
Abdullah was arrested at the border trying to cross from Syria back to Lebanon.
جاي ياخذ مخدرات طلع في هيك عباية ومشاي ما في تياب أنا من هذه النقطة انكمشت فيها أول شيء وبعدين حبسنا سنتين.
Despite the experience and for a man claiming to fear retribution from IS, Abdullah says he retains some respect for the group.
قاعدين تمام قاعدين.
In Lebanon, Luke Waters, SBS World News.
Unregulated child labour continues unabated among Syrian refugee children in neighbouring Lebanon. Some as young as 5 are forced to work in back-breaking agricultural jobs for less than $1 an hour. SBS reporter Luke Waters reports from the Bekaa Valley. And a warning, this story contains images some viewers may find distressing.
8-year-old Rami prides himself on his ability to nimbly pluck spuds from the fertile soil of Lebanon's Bekaa Valley. Forced from Idlib, Syria, a few years ago, he's had precious little education and says he doesn't mind the work or the rewards. I do it for the money, he tells me, but of course he has few alternatives, like the 500-odd other refugee women and children who harvest potatoes from this plantation. Men with menacing sticks patrol the fields and are heard to abuse the children. Some are manhandled, and the absence of workplace safety is sickening, as this incident highlights. Luckily, the youngster bounces up and continues his work. Landlord Rabia Scuff says the labour provides a much-needed living for the refugees. He sells the potatoes to a wholesaler in Beirut for about $6 a bag and says he's comfortable having women and children undertake the gruelling work.
It depends on the age. I think up 8 or 9 years, it's okay, but down, it's unfair. But they need money.
The temperature here today will reach the low to mid-30s and the working day will last a little over 6 hours, but for these kids there'll be few breaks. The wage is $5 per day.
A Lebanese law preventing Syrian men from working exposes the women and children to the punishing labour. It's a rule the United Nations wants reviewed.
When the refugees arrived, some of them might have had savings, but over time those have been completely depleted.
It's estimated 90% of the million Syrian refugees in Lebanon are now in debt.
We're shocked when we hear tales like that, and it's of course not something that we would wish upon any child at all, anywhere here or in other countries. We would say that young children should be at school. They shouldn't be working on the fields, they shouldn't be on the streets, they should be learning in school.
12-year-old Alla agrees. She attends the United Nations school when she can. But while her hands are busy in the Lebanese soil, her mind is elsewhere, with aspirations to one day be a teacher. At the end of the working day, the children are lined up and counted in case some have escaped. Those suspected of stealing a potato or two to feed the family are searched. They're then released and trucked back to the simple camps they call home. Some managing to smuggle forbidden bounty. In the Bekaa Valley, Lebanon, Luke Waters, SBS World News.